Hey guys, so my name is Matt Beatty, and this is the Pittsburgh JavaScript Meetup, which is part of Code and Supply, which is a community of software professionals who have all sorts of cool stuff like this. A bunch of other meetups under our banner. We have a whole bunch of events, which I'll direct your attention to over here. It's kind of lo-fi, low-tech, but you can see some of the upcoming stuff here or on Meetup. Two particularly interesting things that, so if you don't know, Code and Supply also puts on some conferences. The big one that we put on every few years is Abstractions. And if you think your company might be interested in sponsoring and you want to know how to pitch it to your company, or you think you can get a decision maker at your company to come to an informational meeting, we have a sponsorship session thing where we will.
Yeah. What's the date of that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was about to get to that. November 6th. And then on November 7th, we have the Global Day of Code Retreat, which is basically like a bunch of cool exercises. Talk to Justin about that afterwards. He can give you more information. But it's like a whole day of learning how to code better, and it's not just for like beginners, not just for advanced people, fairly TDD focused, but yeah, anyway, it's cool. The other thing that I'll say is, and I'm going to actually get near the microphone for this one so that people on the interwebs can hear, the JavaScript Meetup needs speakers. I think we have somebody lined up for November, but we definitely need somebody for January and then somebody for February. I'd really like to put off me speaking as long as possible, so please volunteer to speak. If you need a second set of eyes on a talk, some feedback, I'm more than happy to meet up with you and give you that feedback if that's what it'll take to get you to give an awesome talk and share your insight with the world. I would love to have you guys talk, less of me talking. And speaking of less of me talking, this is Ryan Boland. He has good things to say about cool things to say about React Native. At least I would assume. So without further ado, I turn it over to him.
Thanks. As long as nobody volunteers to talk about Redux, that'll be good. So today I want to talk about React Native and some things I've learned over the past year of building a few applications with it. My name is Ryan Boland. I work at a small consultancy called Tanuki Labs. We work both with brand new companies and larger teams, and we do all kinds of things, web development with Rails, React Native, some machine learning, and also a few hardware projects. This is my little daughter, Amelia. She's 2, and when I'm not working, usually I'm just chasing after her. And all my contact information is at the bottom there. I have a lot of slides and there's some code and stuff, so don't feel like you have to take notes through everything. Here's the link for the slides. I'll leave that up for 30 seconds and then I'll put it back up at the end if anybody wants. Okay, so some goals for the talk. I want to give a brief introduction to React Native. I wanted to know who is familiar with React in any sense, at least maybe know a little bit about it or have used it before. Cool, so a lot of people. And where are my native mobile app developers? Okay, yeah, so you might want to work on your resume after this one.
Oh, that was another joke. Very quick.
So after I'm going to give, I'm not going to spend too much time on React Native itself, because if you know React, then it's very easy to pick up React Native. What I want to focus on is sort of the process of developing an app and working within Xcode and Android Studio. I'm going to give a short demo of what it looks like to make changes to a React Native app and debug and things like that. And I want to talk a little bit about how you could decide whether React Native is a good fit for your company, some pros and cons of it. And finally, sort of a sensible blueprint if you want to start your own app, some ideas as to how you might test, how you might set up your continuous integration, things like that. So my experience thus far, I've worked on 3 apps. One was sort of a sticker app, which I just did to get up to speed on React Native. I had another one, which I can't talk too much about, but it's like an app for reading financial research articles. So the company does a bunch of research on different financial products and makes their articles available to their subscribers. And there was a lot of like searching for articles and downloading articles in the background and storing them so you can read them on the train, things like that. The other app I worked on is called Kaching. It's a sort of a live game show app, kind of like Bingo. And the goal of this app is to have college students play it and to market student housing to them. And it's been pretty successful so far. We have games almost every night, and with 500 to 1,000 players. Not wildly successful, but still pretty cool. So I want to talk a bit about like how I got up to speed on React Native. There are really no real prerequisites. It's not too terribly difficult. If you have people on the team that already know Xcode and Android Studio or Android Studio, you will be able to get up to speed a lot more quickly because you'll be able to ask them for help with all the build-related issues and things like that. But more so, I kind of paused on all my other work for like a week or two and just dove in and started building a demo app. And that's really all it took to get up and running was maybe a week and a half. Another thing to mention, if you don't have anybody who's real familiar with Xcode or Android Studio, maybe one person can really focus on Xcode and another person can really focus on Android. You can sort of divide up the work there, and compare notes. React Native, it's a framework for developing mobile apps with React and JavaScript. And here's just a quick sample from the React Native website. It's very basic. So React Native has many built-in components. You can see on the second line there. We're importing an image component, a scroll view, and a text component. And these look just like React components, very similar. You can see here we're just creating a scroll view with an image and some text. It's important to note that React Native is real native. It's not a web view that's displaying web code or anything like that. Your JavaScript is not compiled down to components. You build your JavaScript bundle much like you would use Webpack to build a bundle of JavaScript, and that is what runs and powers your application. You bundle your JavaScript, and it's included with the application binary when you upload it to the App Store. And it runs alongside native code. And how exactly does that work? Each component in React Native, for example, the view component, has a corresponding class with native code or native implementation. And the native implementation is responsible for what you see on the screen and the interactivity and things like that. And it communicates with the JavaScript code over the React Native bridge, which is like just a asynchronous bidirectional communication channel. Practically speaking, you don't have to worry too much about this, except in cases where you might need to debug performance if you're sending too much over the bridge. But in general, this is pretty transparent. So when you first spin up a React app, this is sort of what the directory structure looks like. It's pretty basic. At the bottom, if you're familiar with JavaScript, you have your node modules and your package.json and your yarn lock file. This is a very standard way of including JavaScript libraries. The JavaScript libraries that you might use for React Native could also contain Objective-C or Java code, and they are sometimes included in the the npm package as well, and they are referenced from Xcode or Android Studio out of the Node modules folder. The app.js is sort of like the entry point, the base component for your app. Usually I will just delete this and create an app folder that houses all of the JavaScript code. And then finally, the most interesting part here is the iOS and Android folder. And these are like full native applications inside your React Native project. So it's kind of cool. So if you open the iOS folder, it looks just like a bare bones Xcode project. So you can go in here and make changes just like you would with a normal iOS app. So just a quick overview. Again, I'm not going to get too far into React Native because this is pretty simple if you know React. And this is just another sample from the React Native web page. You can see I wanted to point out the view component is almost like a div if you're thinking of web development. And you pass in all the styling is done with JavaScript. So you pass in an object with properties that look very similar to CSS. And all of the layout is done with Flexbox. So if you've used Flexbox for web development, you'll be able to jump right into this. And again, yeah, this is almost looks exactly like CSS. We're setting the height and the width of each one of these boxes and setting the background color. So like I said, React Native has a ton of built-in components that make getting up and running very easy. Images, text input, various list implementations, which are actually pretty good. They support things like infinite scroll and loading indicators and reuse of cells for performance out of the box. And just a ton of other components that help with various things. Another thing that I wanted to mention is for the portion of code where you don't want to reuse things between iOS and Android, you can create application-specific files. So let's say you wanted a button that was different on iOS and Android. All you have to do is name the JavaScript file. You put a .android.js suffix and a .ios.js suffix. And then when you import that name, it'll just grab whichever one based on the platform that you're on. So a good example of this, and I think maybe like the only case that I've had to use this so far was for push notifications. They're very different on Android and iOS, and React Native supports push notifications out of the box for iOS, but not for Android. So you have to include a separate library. And you don't want to include that library for iOS, of course. So that's where these platform-specific files help. So you can import only the files that you need. Okay, so I wanted to give a quick demo of, oh cool. So I wanted to give a quick demo of what it looks like to just run a React Native app. So here's Xcode. And I've opened within the iOS directory, there's an Xcode project file, and I opened that with Xcode, and I just chose the simulator that I wanted to use, and I'm just going to click play. What it's going to do is it's going to pop up a terminal that is going to bundle the JavaScript. And you can run this by yourself in your own terminal with yarn start if you want, and this won't pop up. Okay, so in the simulator, what it was doing right there was waiting for the JavaScript to bundle up, and this is the app that you essentially start with. So if you wanted to reload the JavaScript, you just press Command R, and you press Command D for a development menu. So real quick, I just want to make a quick change here. So I can make a change and just like that, refresh the app. It's nice because there's no compile time, so it's a little bit faster. Probably not too much faster, but it does add up a little bit over time. And in terms of debugging, let's say I had an issue in one of these functions and I wanted to add a debugger statement here. I would just add that in, and then on my simulator, I press Command D again and click Debug.js remotely. And if you were running this on your actual phone, it's kind of neat. What it would do is execute the JavaScript on your computer, so you can use the debugger. And it pops open this this Chrome window, and over here is the console for whatever JavaScript output you have. And so if I refresh this, it's going to pick up that debugger statement, and I'm able to use this and debug it just like any normal JavaScript code. So if you're familiar with web stuff, this should look very similar, and it's pretty easy to use. Okay, so that was like a quick whirlwind tour of, and sorry, let me just mention Android Studio. So I'm not going to actually run this. Okay, I guess I closed Android Studio. Okay, I'm not going to worry about Android Studio, but Android Studio, you open the Android directory, of course, and running it is very similar to how I ran the Xcode project. Okay, so that was a quick whirlwind tour of React Native. Does anybody have any questions sort of on that stuff?
Do you have any like best practice on how to debug style, or like how do you? I think you can specify the style in line, but that's similar to how React works. But with web applications, with React you can have a CSS file, but how do you like kind of take out like the style stuff on the code?
I think I closed my simulator. Okay. There is an option. Let me see if I can run it. There's an option for sort of debugging components and how they appear visually within that same debug menu. If you wanted to sort of try to figure out why something is not visible or something like that. The other thing is, I haven't run into too many issues with this because the style is just JavaScript, and usually I can figure it out by just printing out the JavaScript, the actual style code, and seeing what it's doing. Okay, this has taken a bit of time, so I'm not going to be able to show that, but there is an option in that debug menu that allows you to sort of point and click similar to how you would do in the browser with CSS. Does that answer your question?
I guess the second part of my question is any best practice for decoupling the style stuff from the React Native components?
I will talk a bit about how I organize that later in the talk. And then if you have more questions, obviously you can ask. Anything else? Yeah.
That's a quick question. I was just beginning to dive into stuff myself. Did you go straight into the native tooling, or did you try out Expo before getting it?
I'm going to talk a bit about Expo further in the talk, so I think I'll wait until then. If it's okay. Any other questions? Okay, cool. But to directly answer your question, I just dove into the native stuff. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the pros and cons of React Native and why you might want to choose it or why you might not want to choose it. The biggest benefit of React Native, I believe, is the faster development time. With our apps, we have noticed that we actually develop React Native apps more quickly than standard native applications. I'm not really sure why that is, because I've never really worked on a full native application myself. But I'll have to ask our native developers if they have any thoughts on that. But we do find that we develop with React Native a bit faster. But the thing is that when we develop a bit faster, we're also developing Android and iOS simultaneously. So we're developing native applications at least twice as fast. So obviously our clients love this, and that's the huge benefit. Most of your code is going to be reused between Android and iOS. Almost all of it. Very few things have I had to do separate implementations. You can also take advantage of a large JavaScript package ecosystem. Things like, if you wanted to use Moment.js for dates or LeftPad for putting space on. So that's a big advantage too. The ecosystem around React Native is pretty good as well. So there are a lot of components that you can bring in as React that are specifically for React Native. Your team can get up to speed quickly. Another huge benefit for us was that we are able to use JavaScript developers to build native apps, and so it makes it a bit easier in terms of hiring and things like that, because folks can work on different projects, depending on what project comes up. I think you definitely need folks that are knowledgeable with Xcode and Android Studio, and depending on your app, maybe even native programming. But you might do something where you have a team lead that is very familiar with iOS development, and then they can work with 2 or 3 JavaScript developers, and works out pretty well. And yeah, the framework is very easy the JavaScript portion of it is very easy to get up to speed on. Okay. And another great thing about React Native, and what makes me feel comfortable building apps with it for my clients, is that there is no lock-in with React Native. You can use it as much or as little as you want. Some apps use it for very basic pages like settings or forms, things like that aren't really important to the app and that you want to just get done as quickly as possible. Another approach is sort of how Discord does it, and Discord is a chat app kind of like Slack, except it's targeted at gamers. And what they have a main component, which is their chat feed. It's their most important piece of their app. And they wrote that in native code, and all the rest of the app is written in JavaScript. So they have that one core component that's really flexible and performant, and they can get all the other benefits of React Native elsewhere. And finally, if your team outgrows React Native, or maybe you have enough, maybe your company's large enough to have separate iOS and Android developers, or something like that, it can always be phased out over time. So some of the downsides are that there are a lot of different technologies being used at the same time, and it can sort of feel like a house of cards. A change in React Native can break your build very easily, or a change in a new feature in iOS or something like that. It can be hard to get the builds running. That kind of goes along with the second part. It definitely makes the build process take longer, and it makes it more complicated because you have the extra step of building the JavaScript, and also you have to deal with incorporating React Native libraries into your build as well. Updates can be very painful. React Native updates are a bit notorious. There's still not a great way to update React Native, but I will talk about that a little bit later. And when things like, a new version of Xcode comes out, it always breaks the build, and that's kind of just a fact of life. I don't know if is that true for native apps too? Okay.
Always have to blame Mexico.
Yeah. Well, a new version comes out, you're not expecting it, and you can't build for a few days. So we have one person not upgrade Xcode. So, and then finally, Android support is lagging a bit. Android was introduced after iOS, so the implementation is just not quite as far along. There are some technical things that are lagging too. I'm not familiar enough with the Android ecosystem to talk about those, but I'm sure if you're interested, you could read up more about the Android support. Practically speaking, for the apps that I've developed, we mostly we don't worry about targeting old hardware or and things like that, so we don't really care as much about the Android support is good enough, basically, for us. I've never ran into an issue with it. Okay, so you decided that you want to use React Native, and now you want to spin up your first app. So you have some decisions to make, and there are a lot of decisions. And the first one is you choose like a framework or a boilerplate. And I come from doing a lot of Rails development, so I'm used to having Rails as a framework that really helps me on projects. And so I wanted to know, should I use a framework? Is there something like that? And from researching it myself, I found that these frameworks, they're like Ignite, for example, is more of a boilerplate, I believe. Like it helps you scaffold your app and stuff like that. Just didn't really find a ton of use out of it. It's pretty simple to I showed you the directory structure. It's pretty simple. You can just put your own, set up your React components and everything however you want to. So I didn't find a ton of value in that. At the opposite end of the spectrum is Expo, which I don't know a ton about Expo, but my general take on it is that it sort of encapsulates your JavaScript code and abstracts away a lot of working with Xcode and Android Studio. So it sort of shields you from worrying about the native stuff. And my opinion on that is the reason I chose React Native is because it's so flexible. I can use native code if I want to, or if there's a library that's appropriate and it's written in native code, I can use it. So I don't want to be locked into Expo. That's just my general opinion on it. And also I found that it is pretty limiting, although I think their feature set is expanding. But it just didn't make sense. You have React Native stacked on top of native as an abstraction in itself. It didn't really make sense to me to stack yet another abstraction on top that could potentially break things as well.
What about like for your development app? Because when you deploy an app, you want to share it with other people, you have to go to Apple or Google or something. There's a process, but with Expo, you can just deploy, and anyone with an Expo app on their phone can check out your app and test it. I think that's like kind of a
Yeah. What is it?
The hot loading of code on he creates a local network on any given device you have, and it'll hot load code from your machine as you're saying, which is it's more of a rapid development tool than any like a framework.
I've seen it be used really cool for like library development. So it's very reproducible way to run somebody's library and see if you wanted to use it in your project. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are some good uses for it. Like if you had a quick app that you just wanted to bang out and you didn't need to use native components, then yeah, I don't see any problem with it. I just think that it sort of limits your flexibility in the long term. Another thing that is difficult and probably way too difficult in React Native is navigation. It's one of the worst parts. So, it's pretty basic. When I first started, I'd think, I could have an app that has a title bar and a tab bar, and I can navigate between screens, but no, there's nothing built into React Native to do navigation. So I just cruised over to Awesome React Native and looked and see if I could choose a navigation library. And you might say that some of these aren't navigation libraries, and I can eliminate like 4 by getting rid of those. So there's still like well over 10 possibilities to choose from for navigation. And I probably spent 2 days because you'll pick one and go down and start implementing it, and then you'll hit a hard blocker. There'll be bugs or something won't be implemented that you need. A big differentiation here in some of these are the ones with that are native. So the ones that say native in the name are going to have native components associated with them, whereas the other ones like React Navigation are written entirely with JavaScript, sort of built on top of React Native. And the native ones are great for look and feel and performance, but if you hit a blocker on it where they don't give you an option to do something, or there's a bug, then you're stuck sort of forking that project and hacking on the native code. So I ended up choosing React Navigation, in part because of the flexibility of it. It is all written with JavaScript. So, for example, if you wanted your tab bar to display a certain way, you would just pass in your own component for the tab bar cell. So you can override any piece of the navigation you want to, and it really does feel native. I mean, the animations are all on point, and it's just generally pretty good. The big downside is that it's not, it says it's easy to use, but it has really bad API, I think. It's just not fun to use, and there's a lot of weird ways to configure things. I think it is getting better, and it is sort of the official navigation for React Native. So I haven't hit any, I've hit annoyances with it, but no hard blockers where I couldn't do something. So I want to talk a bit about organizing JavaScript. I could tell by talking to people beforehand that everybody has sort of opinions on what libraries they like to use and things like that. And that's fine, you can ignore this. But so the way I choose to organize my JavaScript is I have a components directory and a screens directory. Functionally, they're the same, but it's a semantic difference where my screens directory has sort of the top level screens of the app. So it might have a settings screen or a login screen or a onboarding screen, and that would go in the screens directory. And then any reusable components that I create, like a button or a header or something like that, would go in the components directory. That's just a little bit of semantic organization that I like to have. I definitely like using MobX, and the reason for this mainly is that I've seen a lot of people implement Redux very poorly. I believe that Redux can be implemented well. I just haven't seen anybody do it on the projects that I've worked on. Both projects that we've created in-house and projects that we've inherited just doesn't tend to work out very well. And with MobX, I found that getting people up to speed on the code is way, way faster than having them learn everything there is to learn about Redux. Also with Redux, inexperienced folks can cause performance issues very easily, whereas with MobX, that's virtually a non-issue. You have to almost try. So for my MobX stores, I again split these semantically. I have a models directory that is sort of like a domain model, like a user or an article, things like that. And then I also have a stores directory, which is a more abstract thing like the login page store or something. The login page store might instantiate a user record. And just because, here's your Airbnb's take on Redux. Redux is notorious for its boilerplate and has a relatively difficult learning curve. We've provided generators for some common templates, but it was still one of the most challenging pieces and source of confusion while working on React Native. So I think that's a pretty powerful statement. And I think if what the library you're using requires you to write generators because it has so much boilerplate, then you might want to think about that. It's just my opinion. again, back to the folder structure. Oh, and if you have implemented Redux really well, I'd like to talk to you afterwards and learn what you did. Then back to the JavaScript, I have a directory for navigators, and that's just all of the classes from React Navigation. Within the components in the screens directory, I like to organize the components into sort of a pod, where you have a folder for each component. It has the component, the button.js. It has a test. It has the index.js, which just allows you to do easier importing, just makes the import very seamless. And then you have a styles.js, which is where I like to separate out all of the styling code. And also separating out the styling code has an advantage of allowing you to import that style in other components or elsewhere in the app and reuse some of the styling if you wanted to. So we wrote some code, and now let's talk a bit about testing it. Sort of the de facto testing library is Jest. I like Jest a lot, primarily because you don't have to include a lot of extra libraries to use it. It's pretty easy to get up and running, and it has a lot of sensible defaults that help you get up and running quickly. It also includes some cool tools like totally built-in code coverage reports, parallel testing, things like that. So I like Jest a lot. And for your sort of standard JavaScript modules, maybe like a utilities module or something like that, it's pretty straightforward to use Jest. It's like any other testing library for testing basic things. The place I see a lot of people struggle with testing, and myself included, is testing components. I haven't found a great way to do this, but one approach is called Snapshot Testing. Here's an example test. So Enzyme is a library that allows you to do shallow rendering. So with React Native, a lot of the components like the view and the text and stuff like that have native portions. So you can't actually like render them in a test. What the shallow rendering does is it just sort of puts a placeholder in there where your text would be with all the properties that it would receive, so that you can only render like one level down. So you're only rendering your own code in the button, your own code that you wrote for the button. In this test, I'm testing the disabled property, and I want to make sure that it appears correctly and you can't click it when it's disabled. So the bottom line is where the snapshot comes into play. And when you first run the test, it generates a snapshot file, which is like a serialization of what the component looks like. And on subsequent test runs, it's going to serialize it again and then compare it to this file that is stored in your Git repository. And it's going to raise an error if there are any differences. So in this way, you have to be very deliberate about when you change your components, and you can easily see when there are unintended changes. And I like this because if you imagine what this test would look like without the snapshot testing, you'd have to sit and say, like, you'd have to make expectations on each portion of the component that you wanted to verify. So you'd have to say that the button is not clickable, the button is gray, things like that. Whereas with the snapshot, that's all captured in probably more than you want. You can write your own serializer to omit the stuff that you don't want to save. This concept is called golden master testing. You can read more about the pros and cons. In practice, it's better than not writing component tests, I think. We haven't caught a ton of bugs with it, but we have caught a handful of bugs with it, so I'm glad we wrote the tests. There is another, I forgot to add a slide in here, but there is also is an acceptance testing library that actually runs your native app in the simulator and actually does sort of point and click testing of it. It's called Detox. And I haven't got to use it myself, but I'm definitely going to use it on the next project because it looks really good. Because that's sort of been a pain point for a long time with native apps is doing acceptance testing. So now you've written your code and tested your app, and now you want to share it with folks. So every organization is going to set up their builds differently, but here's just a general boilerplate if you wanted to use this or adapt it. So generally we have 3 or 4 different types of builds. Debug is just just for local development, and it uses the staging server, assuming you have like a standard server set up with staging production. An internal build, which is used for internal testing, like the project owner would do the testing on the internal build, and we distribute that with a tool like Fabric Beta or Hockey App. And I believe Fabric Beta is deprecated and it's being incorporated into Firebase. So Firebase is going to have tons of native development tools. Then we have sort of a beta or QA app. This one's a bit optional if you wanted to just have another level of approval before you ship to the App Store. This one would be very similar to a release app, targeting the production API, and you could also send this to beta testers if you wanted to test new features to see if they like it. And then finally, the release app is just, of course, the one that gets shipped to the App Store. So with the different versions, you have a bundle identifier. Looks something like this with the company name usually and the app name and the build type. And you can use React Native device info to pull out the app version if you needed to do things like having extra options in internal builds, like for clearing local storage and things like that for testing. And then just another quick tip is if you're implementing these additional build types like beta and internal that are non-standard, Xcode is a bit hard to set up in this aspect. There's a library called React Native Scheme Manager that helps a lot with this. I think it actually might be required for setting up custom builds, so check that out. And then wanted to talk a bit about continuous integration. I like a service called Bitrise. And to talk a bit about how we do continuous integration, we run the tests and linting for all pull requests. And then for every push to master, we actually build the full internal release of the app, internal build of the app. And I like doing this because it makes sure your apps, your master branch is always buildable. So you don't run into a situation where nobody has bothered to build Android in like 2 weeks. And now you have to spend a bunch of time figuring out why it won't build anymore. So what we actually, how I actually set it up was any push to master, it builds both versions of both Android and iOS, and then it just uploads them to Fabric Beta. So, and then sends an email to any of the testers. So the testers may get 3-4 new builds per day, and it tends to work out really well. So they always download the latest build and test whatever they need to test. Yeah, and then just separate tasks within the CI to build beta and release versions of the app on demand. So then shipping to the app stores is very standard. There's not much that I have to say here. If you've shipped to Android or the iOS App Store before, it's going to be pretty much the same process. And if you haven't, good luck. Okay, so long-term maintenance, this is sort of the phase we're at on one of my projects. And you really have to stay on top of the updates with React Native because the updates can be pretty difficult and time-consuming. And just to kind of illustrate why that is, if you think back to the directory structure when I first created a React Native app, I have the iOS and Android apps in there. And those are sort of a general boilerplate apps for iOS and Android. So anytime React Native needs to change that boilerplate, which you're building on top of, the update has to update that actual code that's in your code base. So it can be pretty annoying, especially with Xcode. The settings for the project are not in a binary format, but it's not exactly human readable. So anytime React Native has to update a setting, you have to sort of do a merge in a format that's not meant for humans to read. It can be pretty challenging. It's some trial and error sometimes. A tool I found, or a repository that I found that's very helpful with this is called rndiff. And for every single version of React Native, they create a git patch for you. So you can see the ones where files have changed are probably going to be the challenging ones because files have actually changed you have to change files in your code base. And having these diffs really makes it easier to sort of step through, and let's say you might want to do one patch a day or something like that. It's kind of nice. React Native has a tool, a CLI tool, that will help you update also, but I very much prefer to do it this way. And so just my personal opinion is React Native is a real game changer for us as developers and our clients because we can ship apps for them so much faster with less sort of hiring issues of having to hire native developers and things like that. So I really like it. I'm looking forward to new developments with it. Just to leave you on a few little things that didn't really fit into the talk you might want to explore more. There's a thing called code push, which if you remember the JavaScript bundle that has most of your app logic, you can use a tool called code push to actually push out a hot replacement of that JavaScript bundle to production apps that are on the App Store. So, and this is actually allowed by Apple's terms of service, provided that you don't change anything major, that you do bug fixes or small improvements. And that can really speed things up because you don't have to go through the whole process of building a new binary, waiting for Apple to approve it, and things like that. So that's really cool. And also, you might want to explore TypeScript or Flow, because one startling thing of working with React Native is you have mobile apps that have sort of runtime errors due to typing and nulls and stuff like that, which it's really weird when you kind of first see it. This is my contact info in the slides again, and thanks for coming out. Anybody have any questions?
Do you find bugs that are coming up from disparities if you don't check Android or iOS after a while? Do you find like doing a lot of development in the Android simulator and then checking back iOS after a delay and finding a problem?
Yes, that can happen, and I think most of that is styling related issues, where the component just looks a little bit different on Android or something like that. That's why you have to have a very good procedure where your product owner always must verify everything for Android and iOS, and that catches a lot of it. Because I personally I don't like developing with the Android simulator as much, so So yes, that does happen. You got a question?
Yeah, how often do you find yourself working in native code?
Very rarely, like a handful of times for the particular apps that I'm working on. That's gonna vary a lot, I think, based on the actual app, the requirements of your app.
Yeah, I did. I just meant kind of practically. You know, what's so like? In what type of app would you find yourself working with a native code?
Something like video.
The thing is that there are really good React Native libraries for most of the very common tasks, like video. I think is a pretty solved problem by a really popular React Native library. I can't really give you an example off the top of my head other than like that Discord one that I was talking about, where their main chat feed has to be very performant, so they wrote it in native code. You might, I've ran into it a few times where I had to write little modules for small weird things like setting a background color at a particular time or something like that. And it's pretty easy as long as you're familiar with the native portion of it.
So I've done a lot of hybrid development using like Cordova and other things like that, and one of the problems that I'll run into there is the performance. You know, if you have something where it, you know, you need something to be really, you know, tactile, like doing push, like you know, kind of like pinching and stuff like that,
Yeah.
it'll get slow, and it's not really a great thing. Do you find with React Native that that's not an issue? Because you said like there's instances where like Discord was using the native because they needed that to be truly performant. Is there a little bit of a degradation in performance with React Native versus true native stuff?
I believe in most cases there is not. I haven't particularly ran into any issues, again, in the apps that I've worked on like that. But you always do have the ability to drop down to native code and resolve those issues if you had to. But practically, no, I haven't really seen anything like that.
I would just throw in there too that Cordova and React Native aren't really, they're kind of a bit apples and oranges because Cordova is it's essentially a WebView wrap in a native wrapper, so you're constrained to the device's web performance that the performance you can get within a WebView versus React Native where you're actually working with the native component. So there's, depending on the component, you'll count more or less of that.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So, do you have any recommendation on platform or validation library?
I think you would use something. I haven't personally used anything, but I think you would use something similar to what you would use in a standard React app. I don't think that would be something specific to React Native. So I think that whatever you know, if you have a library you like to use with on the web, you can probably reuse it there.
I also have a more specific question. So, do you have any experience implementing feature like scroll to top or scroll to a text field? Like, it's super easy to implement this in web development. You can just scroll to a body and the position, but I cannot find a concise, elegant way to implement this in React Native.
I haven't found a concise and elegant way to do it either, but I have done it where, yeah, I have done things like that, and I eventually figured something out. So I think we're on the same page there. Like, there's no great way to do it, but
there's not a global listener or
right.
Xcode.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
something.
I know you touched on it in the presentation, but can you just reiterate again, just so I remember the downsides of the Android side of the development? You have a slide on it, but
Yeah, sorry, I don't really know the technical details behind it. You should definitely research that separately. I would just say that in general, the React or the Android portion of it is a bit less mature because it came out after the iOS implementation. So, Yeah, not as much built in natively. Like I mentioned before, like push notifications, it's fully built in on the iOS side, but you have to use a separate library on the Android side. So things like that. But it's all things that I've been able to work around.
Aside from navigation, what is React missing that you really need or want? And aside from scrolling to a specific view.
Which is very easy in native, by the way. Just to do.
I wouldn't call it difficult. I would call it more like annoying. I haven't came up with anything like that. I don't think there are no major issues, and I usually don't like technologies like this, and I waited a long time to start to try React Native, and I was very surprised and happy with how easy it was and good to use. So.
What's your opinion about like Airbnb's like shutting down React Native?
I think if it doesn't work for your company, then you don't have to use it.
Specific to Airbnb's case, and not like a shortcoming on the React Native one.
I don't think it's a shortcoming for React Native because there are tons of other companies that are using React Native successfully and they like it. Like almost in a response to that Airbnb article, a lot of other articles popped up that say like we're still using React Native and this is why we like it. Like that Discord one in particular was sort of a counter argument.
Yeah, another thing is Airbnb has open source a lot of their React Native component, like the maps. So my concern is if they're moving away from React Native, are they going to still maintain that code?
Probably not.
But somebody else hopefully will take it
Yeah.
over. It's like open source, so that's kind of.
That's another thing. Like I know you said like you're saving time because you're actually building cross-platform, but I mean I've worked in both worlds, and I feel like the time saved is actually wasted on like building bridges, for example, for SDK, or basically fixing navigation, like where you reach an endpoint, like at that point, I was like, oh, I need to fix this, and you spend a week trying to fix it, or week working around it, or there's an update and everything broke, and I have to work.
There is definitely some of that, but I don't think it comes anywhere near the time and investment in like hiring an Android team to build a separate Android app, because none of us know Android. So yeah, that's definitely there. You definitely lose time there, but not nearly as much as like with one of the apps. We built it on iOS first with React Native, and then somebody came along in 2 weeks and ported the entire thing to Android by himself. So that's you just can't write native apps that fast. So
A good bit of that in the past too, and it has to do with, there's kind of like a mindset you have to have going in with a hybrid framework like this, where you have to understand that you should be building your core app from the lowest common denominator and then build out from there. If you go in and try to make your iOS app as iOS-y as possible,
right.
and then say, okay, well, where's our Android one? Yeah, that's going to suck. But if you go in knowing where the shortcomings and the caveats are across the, it's a different experience.
you have to get buy-in from your product team, and they have to be aware of that fact. Your product team has to know that you're intentionally making a trade-off here, and that everything's not going to be exactly native, but we're going to deliver it twice as fast.
And I think Airbnb is massive enough that
Oh,
for
yeah,
them,
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's not
yeah.
like
Yeah.
the time savings is less of a big deal than doing things right, or doing things right.
Ooh.
Interesting.
I mean, like I think yeah,
Doing
it's
things
another
yeah,
like fast versus like
Quality.
the perfect way of doing things.
Is Code Deploy the only game in town, or is there other ones besides Code Deploy, or is that the
Code Push.
Code Push? Sorry.
I think it's the only one that I've seen, and it's built into Microsoft's suite of tools for native development, which actually looks pretty cool. They have things like error reporting and things like that, which is something I forgot to mention.
Have you tried Code? Have you tried it yet?
Code Push?
Yeah.
Not in real production apps, but I have tested it, and it works. It's awesome. Yeah, I think it's cool. We just haven't needed to. We haven't had anything with that type of frequency.
Okay. Yeah, it's a requirement. I'm on we use Ionic, and like I deploy. It's very nice to be able to push to all the customers.
Yeah.
So like, I was thinking about switching, but that was the one hang up. I was like, can I do it? But that's great.
Yeah.
Would you recommend more TypeScript overflow, and why?
I'm not very familiar with either of them. I haven't used either of them in like a real project enough to know to be able to make a recommendation.
I feel like these days I hear a lot more top chatter about TypeScript, so I personally have also always liked it. So
Flow sort of comes out of the box with React Native, so
okay.
yeah.
I think like I've used both Flow and TypeScript. I think like Flow is definitely pushed a lot because it's from Facebook.
Yeah.
But TypeScript has been along a lot longer, and if you want, third-party modules, if you want the types for those, you're probably going to find it with TypeScript. Definition is overflow.
Yeah. That makes sense. That matches my intuition as well. Okay, thanks everybody.
And once again, talks. Please give talk.